we have given over all of our public sessions to our big volume, which is just coming out on May 30th, the Climate Obstruction Across Europe volume, which is coming out from Oxford University Press. And it's going to be open access. That is, you can download chapters for free anywhere in the world. And that's a big deal. Of course, you're going to want to buy your hard copy. You know, there's going to be a hardback and a paperback, so it'll be affordable as well. So just as we get going, I want to give my huge thank to August DeVore, who's behind the scenes here working. She's our program coordinator for the Climate Social Science Network. We have Michael Polgar Cabrera, who's doing a lot of our financial work, Matt Margetta, Paula Francis, Jean Lowenstein, Nina Grayson, Kim Cobb, all in the Institute Brown for Environment and Society. I'm super lucky to have such good support here. Jess and Lily doing PR there. And then on this book launch, we have Kathy and Devin who are doing some really exciting outreach. We're really curious to see if academics can be relevant and actually have a meaningful part of the debate that's going on, in this case about who's blocking climate action in Europe. Partly to that end, we also hired Wendell Trio, who was the former director of CAN, the Climate Action Network Europe, which is an umbrella group over 1,000 climate organizations across the whole continent of Europe. And he has helped us reach out to NGOs who we had meetings with during the writing and then afterwards, sort of briefing them on what's going on. Okay, so just to back up for a second, we have people here. Many are from CSSN and many who are not. So I'll give a little background on CSSN after I close my window, because there's a garbage truck out there. And just for some background, Climate Social Science Network was just an idea 3 years ago. And we founded it in the fall of 2020. And we invited about 50 people. It has grown much bigger. That was about all the people that we knew that were studying obstruction to climate action at the time. And now it's grown to over 550 scholars in 40 countries and growing. And we're really trying to diversify it in terms of world regions, but we are very strong in the global north and trying to really be stronger in the global south. We have a searchable directory at our website, cssn.org, which August kindly just put up. Thank you. And our goal was really to build a field to support young scholars, to provide opportunities for researchers to get going. So we had, small grants. We've given out 52 of these, and we've just given out 25 more. So we're up to 75 grants in about 25 countries. We also have working groups for scholars to find people who care about what they care about and to collaborate and to hear about each other's work. And we have communication support. One of our strongest reasons to exist is because our universities are terrible at publicizing our work. And therefore it sits on a shelf or in an academic journal. And so people who can help us reach out to reporters, press outlets, and to think more strategically about how to communicate. We have trainings. We do this conference. We also have these major projects like this assessment, which I'll talk about in just one second. Just to say, our theory of change is that we have the science of climate change. We know it's happening. We know it's human caused. We know it's serious and that we need to act much more quickly. The science really tells us that we are failing to act at the level that's needed. We have the technology. We have tools that are available. Many of them are mature technologies that have been used for decades, and their prices are dropping. And I'm talking about wind, solar, storage, geothermal, and so on. We have policy tools. We know what works, and yet all three of these, the science, the technology, and the policy, are being undermined by a very complex, organized, well-funded network globally in every country, it's different. That's been really what I've learned as being a co-editor with Bob Brule and Miranda Spencer on this volume, is that there are different actors, there's different structures in the countries, and it works differently. Climate obstruction is different everywhere, but it's real. It's happening. So there's something about CSSN. We define, let me see if I can find those notes. Oh dear. How we define climate obstruction is that it's action to block, here we go. Intentional actions and efforts to slow or block policies on climate change that are commensurate with the current scientific consensus of what's necessary to avoid dangerous anthropogenic interference with the climate system. So intentional actions and efforts to slow or block policies and action on climate change. We found in this, in developing this, in this volume, sort of a series of big trends. We're going to hear about them over the next 2 days. The way this conference is going to go is we have 2 more sessions today that are public, and then we have a members-only reception for CSSN members. Then tomorrow we have 3 sessions on the volume. And then on Friday, we have some closed sessions in which we hear from our working groups and our grantees, and we have a general meeting. The structure is today we're going to be hearing about the 3 of the largest European countries, Germany, Italy, and Spain. In this session, in an hour and a half, we'll have a session about countries that are traditionally seen as progressive, Sweden, the Netherlands, and the EU. Tomorrow, we start at the same time, and then we have a session on traditional laggards, or countries that are seen as lagging behind, Poland, Czechia, and Ireland. Then there's a session after that about countries outside the EU, the UK, Scotland, and Russia. And then final session is sort of our synthesis, discussion, and next steps. So we hope you can join us for some of those, for all those, whatever you choose. What's really cool is that Wendell Trio has helped us line up some amazing commentators. So we have former Greenpeace director of Spain, former member of the Spanish Parliament, co-founder of the Green Alliance. We have, in this coming up session, we have great commentators from press outlets like Desmog coming up. In the next session, we have Friends of the Earth Ireland, former climate ministers of Bulgaria, and so on through these days. And so it's extraordinary. And then we have some really leading journalists who are going to be the moderators to keep track of time and keep us moving along. So I think it's really exciting event. I want to give my co-director, Jennifer Jacquet, a moment to say hello. Hopefully she's still on. She did have to go to a meeting. Are you still there, Jennifer? I think I may have lost my opportunity that she had to go at 10 past. So Jennifer is a professor at the University of Miami, has worked a lot on fishing industry and also agriculture, 2 areas that are not well known. I mean, one of our other sort of guiding principles is that people know about the Koch brothers, people know about Exxon New, but they don't know about the whole other set of actors that are involved in blocking action on climate change. Everybody from law firms, PR firms, you know, the finance industry, insurance, and so on, that are propping up the fossil fuel industry, which is itself blocking action on climate change that's commensurate with what's needed to be done. We hope that our work will be useful for litigators, because that's turning out to be one of the more useful strategies, and one that we're seeing taken up around the world. We'll be hearing a lot more about that. NGOs, advancing action, politicians, investigators, journalists. We are researchers who have sometimes the capacity to really go deeply on issues, and we want our work to be used. So please let us know what you're interested in, and we'll see if we can organize some projects around it. I think we are just like almost right on time now. Anything else from anybody before we get going? I have Hazel's intro here. So Hazel Healy is going to be our moderator, and she'll get to introduce all the speakers in this first session. She's the UK editor of the award-winning nonprofit and climate investigation outlet Desmog. She's also she's a broadcaster, writer, and she specializes in climate and food policy stories that uncover conflicts of interest, double dealing, and greenwashing. She's also a fellow at the Royal Society of Arts, and her other bylines and credits include the BBC World Service, The Guardian, and the LA Times. Hazel, it's been great to coordinate a bit on this, and I really appreciate your taking us forward in the next session. So let me know. I'll be right here if you need anything, but I'm handing it over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, it's exciting. It's an honor to be here moderating this first panel, the first public panel at today's conference. And I think we can agree it's coming at such an important time as Europe goes to the polls in a matter of weeks to get to grips with all the different shapes and forms and actors involved in spreading misinformation around climate and energy, but also food and agriculture, as you alluded to there. So today you'll be hearing directly from the social scientists who are conducting in-depth research on who is blocking action on climate change in Europe. And we are going to kick off with highlights from 3 of the largest European countries. So that's Germany, Italy, and Spain. In terms of how this will run, we're going to hear up to 10 minutes from each speaker before we turn to our commentator, Juan Lopez de Uralde, at the end. And then we'll open up for questions and answers from the panel, from the floor. So we have Germany first out of the starting blocks under the tagline, Hidden in Plain Sight. And speaking on behalf of the authors of this chapter, we have Moritz Neujeffski, and forgive me the pronunciation, I took of my best guess. And he's a visiting researcher at the President's Research Group at the Berlin Social Science Center, who has studied the transformation of the European cohesion policy, looking at how a focus on regional competitiveness has impacted development projects in regions of the European Union. So, Moritz, I will hand over to you.
Yes, thank you very much. I have prepared a small slideshow, so I will quickly try and open this up. Okay, I hope everyone
looks
can
good.
see.
Yeah, we're seeing it. Yep, looks great.
Okay, great. Yes, so hi everyone. First of all, let me say thank you to the CSSN network to be part of this exciting journey in researching climate obstruction, and also for giving the opportunity today to present our findings here. And I'm really curious also to hear from the other groups what they found, and especially to see how climate obstruction actually plays out differently in the other European countries. So today I would like to give you just a brief overview of our chapter, of what we focused on, what we wanted to elucidate with our research. And so basically what we tried to do is to give a summary and an overview of the different, let's say, battles in climate protection that are currently happening in Germany. And so what we did in our chapter is we first of all mapped out the historic movement of the Greens in Germany, and then looked at different policy areas where we've seen climate obstruction happening in recent years, and also mainly to map who are the actors involved and what are their strategies. And I would say, interesting thing in Germany is that there is actually quite a big consensus on the need for strong climate protection. So already in the 1980s, the Green Party formed. There has been big environmental movement coming up, which has fought for nuclear phase out and also politicized the forest pollution that happened back then in Germany. There is a cross-party agreement on a ecological social market economy ideal that we're trying to achieve. So the social market economy has always been kind of a trademark of German economic policy, I would say. And in recent years, this has been updated by an ecological dimension. The energy transition is high on the agenda, and reaching climate neutrality by 2045 has been agreed and is also considered an important task. And initially, climate denial policies or climate denial discourses were marginal in Germany. But we've seen kind of a change going on, I would say, in recent years. And there have been a lot of kind of backsliding moments. So when it comes to nuclear energy, kind of the phase out had already been declared a long time ago, but it's kind of had been prolonged for a long time, again and again. Then there has been strong resistance against the phase out of the combustion engine, speed limits. So I think Germany is still one of the only countries where you don't have a general speed limit, and it's very difficult to enforce that here. So there's been ongoing debates about it, how this is not possible apparently. And these discussions continue until the present day. Transport emissions have not decreased. They've been stable for decades now. And but I mean, these are kind of obvious or I would say prominent policy fields, but there has also been recent other fields and debates which maybe are not always considered kind of the forefront of climate politics. So there has been a law on decarbonizing heating, for example, which had been fought hard against by industry and lobby groups. There's been strong resistance against that. There has been there was an abolition of the feed-in tariff of renewable energy technologies. So this basically changed the way how renewable technologies were kind of spreading throughout the country, I would say. And there have been more and more kind of regulatory hurdles were created when it comes to the expansion of wind energy, especially in the southern regions of Germany, so especially in Bavaria. And on top of that, we've also seen a spread of climate denial positions, which come from kind of the right-wing civil society sector, we argue, and which have been kind of seen an uprise due to the populist right-wing party, the AfD. So they together have basically spread climate change denial positions in recent years. And what we then tried, or in the remainder of the chapter, was to map which actors actually are involved in these climate obstruction efforts. And here I just want to give a brief overview. Maybe in the discussion we can also go into more examples. But of course, what we see is that in Germany we have a lot of multinational corporations with very strong political influence. So from the German car industry to Lufthansa or the aviation industry, they have kind of strong motives to delay policies such as, for example, the ending of the combustion engine. And we show in our chapter how these companies have actually not been arguing against climate change or climate change policies, but always put forth kind of the importance of competitiveness and economic arguments, I would say. We kind of map their position, or with the help of the great work of the NGO Influence Map. So we looked at how they basically judge the company's positions on different climate policy initiatives. And what's quite interesting is that the trade associations in which these companies are actually active, they quite often have even more restrictive or more obstructive views than the companies itself. So in the chapter, we also look at the German chemical industry associations, or the overall German industry association, and see what their positions are on climate policy initiatives. However, we do not only focus on kind of the industry sector per se, so there are of course also other actors involved, and one of them that we highlight are think tanks in Germany, and basically their role in obstructing stricter climate policies. And there are two interesting ones which we basically cover a bit more. There's the Center for European Policy, the CEP. They basically give legal advice or do legal they give legal advice on certain policy initiatives. And here we quite often see that whatever hampers competition is regarded as ineffective, or is advised to kind of lobby against in a way. Then there's also EIKE, which is kind of a forefront organization of the climate denial groups in Germany, which work together with the AfD, and which really have also through the AfD gained more prominence, for example, in debates within the German parliament. So this is still marginal, their influence there, but this is something which has happened in recent years. We also focus on campaigns and their role in obstructing climate policy. So there's one group called the ENSM, which is kind of a lobby organization, I would say, of the German industry. And they always kind of have engaged with the German energy transition, saying that, of course, climate protection is necessary, but there's also the argument of kind of locational costs, or that Germany is losing out economically if we pursue the proposed policies, and therefore they advise to cut down on climate policies. But there are also other networks. For example, there's kind of an anti-wind network, which is which tries to argue for, that they are really bad for nature. This is kind of a different. They have a different stance in society. So there are different actors involved. There has been an anti-heating campaign, or with regards to the recent decarbonization of the heating, which basically argued for kind of high social costs which would be involved. And there are also some other initiatives and campaigns that we focus on. So, and I mean, altogether, what we see is that this, I mean, is not happening like only with regards to climate policies which are under attack, but there are also kind of other policies that play a role. So, for example, our current Minister of Finance from the Liberal Party has always advocated against the speed limit or the end of a combustion engine. But he, for example, also enforced strict austerity policies. And with that, he also kind of worked against the expansion of climate, like stricter climate policies in Germany.
Moritz, we need to
Yes.
start wrapping up so we can, because we have
Okay,
commentators and 2 more papers.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, I didn't see my timing. So I'm already coming to my last slide then. What we try to show here is what we need is kind of a stronger analysis of the opponents and also see how they are working basically internationally, how they're connected through organizations such as the Atlas Network. And on the other hand, we also need kind of like more strategic alliances between environmental but also social groups within Germany to fight kind of the strong industry groups in Germany. Yeah, thank you. I'm sorry for taking a bit longer. Looking forward to the debate. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Moritz. I think that just gives us an amazing sense of what we're up against and the extent of the challenges and the different kinds of actors. And I must say that's something we see a lot at Desmog. You know, the industry, actual individual companies can have fairly progressive positions, but be members of trade associations that have much more aggressive positions, which allows them to kind of appear sort of cleaner than they might be behind the scenes. And really, I think we see in Germany, and I'm sure in other places too, how that space of engagement is moving from, you know, direct denial to, well, it's not that we're against climate policy, we just don't want to lose competitiveness. So it's just a shifting kind of terms of engagement. And we've seen that a lot in the UK as well with heat pumps, lots of disinformation, similar to Germany. And yes, the subtle arguments that are harder to combat, you know, it's not that they're anti-wind, they're just pro-birds. You know, how do you respond to that kind of manipulative messaging? So that's a fantastic start. Thank you. We're going to move next. Is it Stella Lavantesi who's going to present the chapter? Yes. Hello, Stella. Fellow journalist. So yes, we're going to have Stella now, who's going to speak to us to the Italian context, presenting highlights on their chapter, which is with the tagline "From Outright Denial to Widespread Climate Delay." Stella's a fellow climate journalist and also author of the book Climate Liars, which is published in Italy and in Germany, which looks at the history of climate change denial tactics used to obstruct climate action. Over to you, Stella.
Thanks, Hazel. Nice to see you again. Hello, everyone. I will try and share my screen. Hopefully it's going to work. There we go. Can everyone see it?
Looks great.
Okay, great. I can.
Thanks, Stella.
Yeah, perfect. So I'm gonna try and whiz through this for time constraints. Basically, this is sort of the outline of the presentation. We're gonna have a historical overview before going into the major actors involved in climate obstruction in Italy, and then tactics and strategies they use, and then finally discursive framings. So in our chapter, we divided this historical overview into 5 periods. So the chapter sort of investigates climate obstruction from the 1990s onwards. The first period goes from 1990 to the 2000s and is characterized by what we called instrumental realism. So cherry picking of climate facts and transfer of responsibility to non-anthropogenic causes. Let me get this out of the way. Does anyone know how to, there we go, perfect. The second period from 2001 to 2007, characterized by the outright hostility to towards science on climate change, especially with attacks to the IPCC reports. Period 3, from 2008 to 2013, characterized by attempts to shift attention away from climate change, especially dominated by the libertarian narrative. And during this time, the issue of climate change was particularly relegated to the margins, and also coupled with efforts to deny urgency and the need for action. In the fourth period, which goes from 2014 to 2018, politicization of climate change and polarization within the public debate. And this was taken advantage by both sides of the political spectrum to implement climate obstruction. Period 5 goes from 2019 up to today, characterized by the dominant role of oil and gas company Eni, which, and highlighting here the pervasiveness of the company. Rino Formica, an Italian politician, has said that the weakness of Italian parties in politics has allowed the company to capture the state. Going into actors and institutions, there are 7 that we identified. These actors have close ties to one another, and obviously they operate with similar, sometimes overlapping modes of climate obstruction. So the first one, as you can imagine, fossil fuel and fossil fuel adjacent companies, in particular, again, hegemony of oil and gas company Eni, very entrenched in the decision-making process with close ties to institutions and governments and influencing again, decision-making process both at the national and European and global level. Industry groups such as the Chamber of Commerce, called Confindustria, which has lobbied against regulatory legislation for the oil and gas sector at the European levels, and backing also fossil fuel projects and investments. Politicians and political parties, especially right-wing, even though obviously not exclusively right-wing, who have prioritized industry over climate policies, promoted and facilitated fossil fuel access to decision-making, and facilitated infrastructure investments and gas deals. Voting against climate policies at the European level, promoting climate disinformation and denial online, and through their social media accounts. The discourses of climate delay that you all probably know about, and then more recently attacking climate activists and movements. Fourth actor that we identified is think tanks. Within this category, in particular, the prominent libertarian think tank Istituto Bruno Leoni emerges, which has promoted climate change denial, and has with ties to the international and US climate denial machine in particular. A large part of the misinformation in Italy has revolved and emerged from well-known figures who have denied the existence and the human responsibility for climate change. These have remained, they would have remained mostly at the margins if it hadn't been for enabling actors, in particular media platforms. So outright denial still being sort of central, even though there has been more recently a development into arguments that delay and hinder climate policies. Media, especially relevant in Italy, as it functions as a public echo chamber for climate denial and delay and obstruction, and promoting deniers' arguments and views, and diverting responsibility for the climate crisis from the industrial level and production to the individual consumer. Signing partnership deals with polluting industries, including hosting advertising, misleading advertising by companies, by fossil fuel companies and sponsorships. This issue isn't just relegated to right-wing conservative media, but also some media that is considered progressive by the public, obviously with the result of creating confusion and sending contradictory messaging to the public. Finally, financial institutions and banks promoting climate obstruction and investing in fossil fuel expansion. In particular, amongst these banks, Unicredit and Intesa San Paolo. Tactics and strategies. All of these actors have adopted and adopt multiple strategies to obstruct climate action. Their ultimate objective is to either delay or hinder climate action. There is a recurring pattern which is parallel to the international pattern of climate obstruction, in that these strategies and tactics are sort of fully deployed and kick off when climate policies and legislation are at the center of the public debate, and when extreme weather events contribute to visible evidence of the climate change impacts. These strategies range from, again, outright climate denial to greenwashing, very common in Italy, both at the corporate and political level, and then delayer arguments that have been developed more recently, like technological optimism, fossil fuel solutionism, and policy perfectionism and doomism. And then other additional tactics, which again include attacking climate activists, downplaying the role of renewables and misinforming on renewables, and then sponsorships and partnerships. And then finally, discursive framings. Again, we've identified 5 periods, and the first period being what we call defensive obstruction, largely carried out by fake experts who again cherry pick. Second period, a positive obstruction, where science is directly under attack. The third one, dismissal obstruction, with minimization of climate change effects and sort of confuting the urgency of the climate crisis. Fourth period, ideological obstruction, with the driving narrative being that climate action is a risk and threatens our way of life. And then finally, period 5, with which we called greenwash and delay obstruction, the more recent one, where fossil fuel saviorism emerges, and the newer sort of discourses of climate delay that we mentioned earlier. So in conclusion, what our research has found is that the weak and unfortunately in many cases inexistent climate commitments on both political and institutional, and of course corporate levels in the country, show that these obstruction efforts have actually been, at least in partly, successful in delaying or hindering effective climate policies and tangible progress toward decarbonization targets. Thank you very much. I will stop sharing my screen. There we go. Thanks.
Thank you, Stella, for that quick whirlwind tour through the Italian disinformation landscape. It was always something when I came to this sector as a journalist, that it was amazing to me that actually to learn that people are most vulnerable to climate misinformation when they're experiencing climate impacts, because while they've experienced and seen it with their own eyes, they're frightened and they're vulnerable to people who can give them scapegoats or other like explanations for why they're in a bad situation. So particularly, real reasons there to inoculate people against some of that misinformation when it lands, and how terrifying that you can have, state capture by one oil company is quite a different kind of landscape to the one we were painted there from Germany. So thank you for that, those contrasts. That brings us now to Spain, where we have a chapter with the tagline "Boycotts on Renewable Energy Expansion and Blocking Compassion Towards Animals." So to guide us through this chapter's highlights, we have Jose Moreno, who is a pre-doctoral researcher in the Department of Communication at Pompeu Fabra University, whose work focuses on climate change communication, climate action, obstructionism, journalism, and interest groups. Thank you, Jose.
Hi, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, and do you see the slides well? And do they move and everything?
Yep.
Everything.
Okay, perfect. Here we are. Okay, thank you for the introduction. I did my PhD with the direction of Dr. Nuria Almiron. I addressed issues focused on climate obstruction, and also in another research project led by Nuria, which is called Compass, we focused on more, we deepened in the industry of the meat, and we merged all the research we have in this chapter as an overview, focusing also in the questions we were asked to answer. And here I will start with the introduction of the situation of Spain, in which we have a context when since 2007 emissions have been decreasing, but due to the efforts in the energy sector. That's because we have focused in the history of the chapter in the energy sector. But we think that also the diffuse sectors such as transport or animal agriculture or other areas such as tourism, for example, should be addressed now because we have focused more on energy and less in other sectors. But that's because in the history of climate obstructionism in Spain, energy has been a core issue. Even since the dictatorship, we have seen some tactics that has been compared from by historians to the ones that were developed in Merchants of Doubt, the famous book, because the fascism used experts to deny the data and to dissuade action towards the environment in general. But those tactics are very similar to those that were developed after. Then we have another period when the democracy was restored, when the electricity market was not regulated according to public interests, but to private interests. And a highlight is the privatization of Endesa, for example, the public energy company and one of the most polluting companies. Then an interesting period was in the 2000s when Spain was a pioneer in renewable energy, but then due to the economical crisis and also to the efforts of lobbying against these policies, the policy making directed towards promoting renewable energy was off the game. And after the economic crisis, the conservative government applied a tax on solar self-generation, which was very hard for the sector. And now we are in a period in which we have climate change cultural wars and a lot of greenwashing, when we don't see outright denialism, but a lot of empty commitments. For example, the COP25 in Madrid was sponsored by Spanish polluters, but the government was advertising it as a very special event and a huge commitment by the country. Also, the first climate change law was developed, but there was a lot of controversy because the far-right party Vox opposed to it and distorted the debate. And we are seeing a lot of controversies regarding the car use in the local governments, also regarding diet due to a government campaign about this. And that's an overview of the situation. When we mapped the stakeholders, we divided them between political parties, lobbies, think tanks, media, and citizens. As for political parties, we think that the Conservative Party has been between skepticism and free market as a solution. Meanwhile, the Social Democrat PSOE has been between the climate action and greenwashing. Only Vox is in explicit obstructionism nowadays, and other green parties or leftist parties advancing in climate action are not as relevant as the main PSOE and PP. There are also lobbies, of course, from the energy and animal agriculture sectors. Think tanks are not that relevant in Spain, but For example, FAES has had an interesting role translating skeptical books in the 2000s. It's a think tank linked to the Conservative Party. Also, the Juan de Mariana think tank has had an interesting role in participating in transnational campaigns against the green policies in Spain. And in the media sector, there are not really strong skepticism as it has been studied, but in the opinion, genre, and the economic newspapers, there are some strongholds. Also, citizenship can be counted as obstructionist, since people think climate change is important, but there are no commitments towards any important actions regarding diet changes or air travel and strong commitments. Then, regarding the strategies within that, all the standard tactics of public relations can be identified regarding climate obstructionism in Spain, but we highlighted 3. Regarding policymaking, there have been, I wouldn't say nowadays it happens, but in the past it was very controversial because revolving doors in both former presidents and cabinet members ended up as advisors and board members of the big energy companies that were among the most polluting companies. Also, regarding the media, through the ownership of the media and advertising, polluting companies have been able to control the discourse. And regarding public opinion, passing the responsibility to the consumer or boycotting educational campaigns, such as one that happened here regarding green protein campaign, a vegan protein campaign on meat emissions that was sued and lost. It can also be a tactic. Then I'm finishing with a case study, which we selected because we think with this transnational approach, it's interesting because this campaign from Pro Vacuno and Interpork, which are meat lobbies, Spanish meat lobbies, they received European funds to develop transnational campaigns to promote meat culture from Spain to other countries. In this case, I think it was in Belgium, and I think that France as well. The campaign was in English, in Spanish, and sometimes in French. And this happens in a context in which Spain is the EU country with the highest meat consumption per capita. And the consumption must decrease by 76% by 2030 to meet the climate commitments of the country. And these campaigns were Become a Vegetarian, which said that instead of becoming a vegetarian, you should become a vegetarian and enjoy meat. This campaign was modified after sexist claims being criticized in the press, and it can still be consulted in their website. And the other campaign, Let's Talk About Pork, followed a narrative of debunking myths. So they say environmental impact of pork industries, it's fake. Animal welfare of our industry, it's real. And they followed that line.
About 1 more minute, Jose.
Yes, thank you. As a conclusion, we think that in the 2000s and 2010, obstructionism was more directed at the energy field, but now it's focused on diffuse sectors such as transport, such as diet. Within that, we are in a context that is very polarized, which should be addressed. Also, the industry has a lot of power, but we should not only focus energy industry, but meat industry or transport industry as well, and to promote more transparency among lobbies and a more corporate public relations. Thank you very much. And if you want to stay updated of our research, you can follow this website. Thank you.
Thank you, Jose, for that, for raising the important issue of revolving door, which is such a powerful route of influence between companies and politicians, and route to regulatory capture can't be underestimated. And I think especially the idea that climate policy is coming after the food choices of Spanish and Italians has proved a really strong sort of divisive culture wars argument. I think particularly in Italy, where you have like billboards at the moment claiming that the EU is coming to make you eat insects, and the same kind of tropes circulating as well in Spain. So that brings us to our two commentators. Apologies, Giuseppe, I didn't introduce you at first, but I will introduce you in a moment. We have Juan Lopez de Uralde and Giuseppe Onufrio. And we're going to start with Juan, who can follow straight on there from Spain. And so Juan is a co-founder of the Green Alliance Party, a former director of Greenpeace Spain, and a former member of the Spanish Parliament. He's spent his career dedicated to green movements and remains an active voice on climate policy within and outside his native Spain. So you've got more or less 5 minutes, Juan. Any reflections for us?
Thank you very much. Do you hear me well? Yep. Well, I think that the most interesting input I could put forward in this meeting has to do with my role in the Spanish Parliament, especially when I was chairing the committee or the commission who decided or approved the Spanish climate law. Because many of the very accurate inputs from the different presentations I've heard and read were, in my case, were experienced during this period. And there is a number of things which I want to highlight. First of all, I usually try to use this information to improve the way we can work, we can develop effective climate action at political level, and that's what I will obviously try to do with all the inputs. There are a number of things, especially that at least I could comment from Spain. The first is that the rise of the extreme right populism, which is true, I think, all around Europe and very much in Spain, is conditioning all the climate debate. Because not because in Spain the extreme right is very strong, because they are not, but they do have a very strong influence on the conservatives, on the right wing, and this makes a big difference. For years, the conservatives were somehow far from climate politics or from climate commitment, but through I would say, in the early 2000s, they started to move towards a more proactive policies on climate change. But now they are moving backwards, and that's very, very clearly seen in the parliament and on the way the conservatives do position themselves. This obviously is very negative, because we have, as main actors, we have a Social Democrat Party which is committed to climate, but not as much as is necessary. So the proposals they put forward are not enough, and then the conservatives fight them back. Then somehow at least my experience is that the climate debate in media terms is like a bubble, but doesn't transfer or doesn't have an equivalent at political level. And for example, when we have political debates, at this moment we have the European elections, and there is a high level debate, I would say, in all of Europe, and the climate debate is not present. It's not present on the political debates. It's a very it's very low on the agenda. If you compare it to what the polls say, that opinion polls talk about up to nearly 80% of Spanish public is either aware or very aware of how bad climate change is. This is not reflected on the level of the climate change debate in the political debate. It's out of the political debate. I think this is a drama. This is a drama because we need very, very urgent and important action, and we are discussing many other things which are not so relevant. If you add to that the strongest social movements in the last, I would say, year or couple of years has been against environmental measures such as the agriculture sector movement, then we have a perfect cocktail to do nothing about climate change, which is exactly the opposite of what we need. So I think we need to extract lessons and conclusions on how can we in this atmosphere, in this environment, move forward. There's one other thing that I have heard, and it's true in Spain as well, is that the attacks on climate activism is rising. For example, we had a report from the public prosecutor, which is a governmental, let's say, governmental body, and it was naming as terrorists some climate activist groups. This, of course, had a lot of impact on the media. The public prosecutor had to move back, but it was dropped there as calling them as terrorists. So I think that this whole reality puts us in a very difficult position compared as to what science is asking us to do. So we need to move much more quickly, and we have a social environment which is not helping us at all. So I think that I don't have answers on how to deal with this situation. I think that there needs to be more, I would say, I don't know the English word, but more links or better work together between scientists, activism, and progressive politicians in order to ensure that the opportunities we have are correctly used. Because sometimes I think that even those who want to move quicker don't get enough support from activism and from NGOs and so on. And I think that this needs to be addressed, because in the actual let's say social environment we have, any movement forward needs to have a lot of social support. Otherwise, the real risk is that we are not only not moving forward but moving backwards. So I think I thank you for organizing this debate. I think it is extremely important, extremely useful, and we need to put all these ideas into real action, into real politics, because otherwise we are going to lose. I'm sorry to bring a bit of pessimism, but this is how I see it from the political arena here in Spain. Thank you very much.
Thank you for those reflections. A call for action to stop paralysis at best, backsliding at worst. Giuseppe, do you want to add? I'm going to introduce you now. So Giuseppe has been the director of Greenpeace Italia since 2009. You must have seen it all. He is a trained physicist and spent years as a researcher in the environmental and energy fields, an environmental activist himself since the 1970s. He's used his research background to further climate policies and initiatives. Any thoughts from you, please?
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me. And hola to Juan, my old colleague, and Wendel also, and Stella. I appreciated a lot the Italian presentation, and I very much agree on the basic approach. And I think Italy is a certain way is almost unique among the European countries, a country where the oil and gas industry was state-owned, now is a private company controlled by the state through 30% of golden share. But Eni is ruling on energy since decades with every government. And I would add to what Stella wrote with other colleagues, the best case is during the government in 2020-21, Conte first and Conte second, where the five-star movement was in the government. The five-star movement has been campaigning for years with very green messaging on renewables, for instance. And when they were in the government, nothing changed in our policy. The big fight started, I would say, 2011, 2012, when we had, during the Berlusconi government, so the right-wing one, we had a quite huge jump for a couple of years of solar installations and wind installations. There was a very strong reaction by Eni at that time. 2013, Eni CEO was attacking renewables, saying that investing in renewables is an act of drunk people. Okay, so what I disagree a little bit is that the anti-renewable campaign is not a side effect or additional strategy, but has been in Eni the main one. So Eni is attacking everything that eats the fossil gas market. Because if you look at Eni, they do a lot of greenwashing, but formally, they are not deniers. Okay, and the other, in the chapter, Stella and the others, they quote, and thank you for that, quote Greenpeace research on media. But I would have spent 2 lines more to say, what is the main strategy? The main strategy, yes, there are some of the deniers, and I think in the chapter, these are very well described. But the more subtle strategy, which I find more dangerous, finally, is what the main media do. The main media, they shift the conversation on emissions, cover oil, gas, and oil, okay, so that most of the public is not aware that because of oil, gas, and coal, we see the climate impact. So this is the main strategy, and we are now just issued the latest report on media and climate in Italy, 2023. Another point that is described in the chapter is the change in the Catholic Church. This is very interesting in a Catholic country, and I would say, being the Catholics, 1.2 billion is relevant, not only for Italy, but there is, and I think the latest letter the Pope issued in September last year is against climate deniers within the church. And I think this is very interesting to analyze and to follow, because, you know, the big actors, they move slowly, but they do move. Okay, so I would expect that if this line of Pope Francis will be held like it is now, and he is now in the last day saying that the climate pathway is a pathway to death. Okay, so he's very strongly attacking on climate. And then, yes, on the political side, I think the situation is not much different with what Juan Lopez said on Spain. I think, yes, the five-star movement is interesting because they won elections in 2018 with 30% of votes. And they did not do anything to change the market. They had other priorities. They did something on efficiency in the buildings, but on the power sector, and now what we see is an anti-renewable campaign. We see again, the new governor in Sardinia. Sardinia is, as I think, the best wind potential in Italy, has a good solar potential, and the new governor from Five Star Movement is blocking for 18 months everything, because there is an assault. Sardinia is assaulted by big investors. So all that is aimed to keep fossil gas in the center, and that I think is a lesson we can take from Italy. The lesson is different from other campaigns we have run in the past. On climate, the oil and gas is not able to do anything, is not willing, is not able to do nothing serious on transition. So for them, it's a matter of life or death. This is the reality. And since they are incumbent in society, since they are so strong, we are in the Aristotelian dilemma that who are very strong can block the reform, and those who could benefit, the citizen and also new sectors from the reform, are too weak to win the political game. So we are in this. Something is changing, I think, but the change is too slow. And I always said in some political debate I am invited, these things we all have in our pocket. We didn't get this because of a political decision. Technology arrived. And I think technology is arriving also in the energy sector, in the car sector, but too slowly. And so I think they are going too slowly for the climate crisis, but they are enough quick to put them in danger, to put big interests in danger. So, and this is true at national level, and I can say this is true also at the international level, because if you look at the oil and gas producers, yes, some of them are also investing in solar or wind, or even in nuclear, but it's a quite different game if you can around the world, because under your feet there is oil and gas, compared to a new industry where there is a huge competition and you need a different societal organization. And that's the reason why I see the Russian war is closely linked to their role in the oil and gas. They could change, they have a huge wind potential, but their society, their let's say their hierarchy, the social hierarchy, is linked to oil and gas and pipes and holes, and because if they change it, all the society should change, because new actors will come up with a different relationship between employed and industries and so on. So we are, I think, in the midst of a climate crisis, and we are also on the brink of a global war, because if you look the past, the history, all the elements for a new global war are on the table. And I think in that sense, climate is very important also on that side, because if Europe, United States, China, and maybe India, they resume a climate talks, they resume collaborating, this is, I think, the only one barrier to a more global conflict, because all the conflict we are seeing now, they could become a unique one. So I think we are in danger, but there are signs of hope. At the moment, with the US elections, you see that Biden is taking a hard stand against China. But I think that after election, I hope that the dialogue between Western countries, China, India, on climate is the only chance we have to move the situation away from the danger we see. But thanks for the effort and thanks for the analysis. And so I have just said some little things on the margin that is our view are different from the others, but the bulk is I very much agree. And yes, Eni is the real enemy. And yes, this is the real reason why we decided to open a litigation with the company and not with the government. Because actually, who is ruling is the company, it's not the Italian government, whatever party is in the government.
Thank you, Giuseppe. Some sobering geopolitical analysis there. If you see the Ukraine war as the death throes of a petro-state war, yeah, that puts a new slant on various conflicts in the world today. But yes, deadly delays. I think delays is also what we're seeing in country, throughout Europe. We do have some minutes left now for questions. We've got 5 minutes exactly. I'm going to go to...
You could go to 1/2 so 15 minutes is
Oh,
fine.
really? Okay, great. So we have 2 questions in the Q&A currently. I'm gonna take the top one, something I'm interested in too, and that's from Ana Romero Vicente for Moritz. And she writes, in Germany in particular, there have been a number of violent incidents involving Green Party politicians. How much can these be linked back to online disinformation and vitriolic posts towards Greens? And you've had direct, even from German MPs, haven't you? You've had incitements to violence against Greens, let alone online disinformation. But yes, would you like to take that question, please?
Yeah, I mean that's a really good question. It's true, we've seen that in the recent couple of months that it has kind of the level of violence has increased. Also, there has been kind of a huge farmer movement, farming protests here in Germany or here in Berlin a couple of months ago, where also this was kind of linked to attacks on politicians. Also, Habeck, our Green Minister of Economics, he wasn't attacked, but he was blocked by farmers, and it was a very aggressive situation there. I have to be honest in how far this is linked to disinformation. I would need kind of, I think, or it would be an interesting field to see that and how far this is linked to disinformation. However, if you look at least at these farmer movements, their messages and their articulation of position towards climate change, you see that there's a very aggressive rhetoric, and they've also the groups that were behind organizing such protests, they were of course using a lot of social media channels in order to kind of spread their message. So I would say it's highly likely, and it would be really interesting to look more into this topic, definitely.
I'm aware that attacks on climate activists is not unique to Germany. Does any of the other panelists want to come in on that question? Links to misinformation and attacks on climate activists or green activists, politicians.
I was thinking here, for example, there are some climate activist groups that have been categorized as terrorists, and I think that for other protests or for other problems, they don't go that far as categorizing as terrorists the movements. So maybe that's something related to basic freedom in democracy and how to address protest and reivindications. I don't know. And I was also thinking, meanwhile the others were talking, Moritz, that I think that in addressing online misinformation, I will find interesting to research for further works or whatever, why these messages are that effective, because probably they are tipping into needs of the people or worries, and probably green messages or other calls for action are not doing that as well. I don't know. I have only questions maybe, but I would say the same happens in all Europe in general, with nuances, but in general, yes.
And I mean,
One
Juan, yeah, as a lifelong activist, I'm sure you'd agree that attacks on climate activists is not new, but is the online misinformation making it worse, I suppose would be the question.
Yeah, we are in a world in which fake news are having a stronger influence, but one thing I wanted to mention is that especially in Spain, it is getting harder for those groups or individuals which are working on the smaller villages, rural areas. That's becoming a very threatening place to work on environmental, not only climate, but in general environmental issues. It has to do with, as Moritz was mentioning, with the farmers, I would say, aggressiveness, and for local groups, people working on smaller villages, it's becoming even a risk to raise their voice on defense of animal species or threatened ecosystems and so on. So this is something that needs to be as well tackled. Added to the legal persecution that José Antonio was mentioning, which is very real in Spain. Not only a persecution from extreme right groups, but persecution from police or from even the public prosecutors. So it's getting harder. Yeah.
Thank you. Stella, did you want to come in?
Yes, I just wanted to add that all of this is also probably compounded with the way that the media in Europe is covering these protests. And there's analysis, for example, one by the Institute of Strategic Dialogue and others that have emphasized how there's some points of contacts in the media coverage in countries like France, Germany, and Europe, for example, where what emerges from the coverage of the protests and of this more recent climate activism is antagonism, is weaponizing language and messaging of eco-extremism, the othering and mocking of the activists and activism as well. And so clearly this has some impact in, and this is very visible in Italy as well, it has an impact in the shaping of the public debate on the issue and the perception of the issue by the public as well. And so also leverages things like frustration and rage and other issues that all sort of contribute to this problem. And then, sorry, this is unrelated to this specific issue, but just something that I was thinking about while Giuseppe was speaking, which is quite interesting, and it's sort of a more recent trend, very true about sort of this war against renewables. But what has also emerged more recently is that oil and gas company, in particular through their lobby groups at the EU level, have actually voiced support for renewable energy in order to foster the perception that gas and renewables are roughly equivalent in terms of sustainability and that they can work together in a decarbonized energy system. So there's this sort of more subtle level of misinformation and disinformation as well that's going on. And all of this is included in our chapter. Obviously, you know, in the presentation, I would have wanted to include much more. The situation in Italy, as other countries as well, is very complex, but for time constraints, I tried to keep it to the key points. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to move to our next question from Wojtek Pekka, who asks a more general question about the rise in popularity of conspiracy theories more generally. And she notices that they notice that in the Czech Republic, one of the climate denial subcultures is that of alternative medicine or esoteric groups, and that this was surprising And do you see the same? I will say that from Desmog's perspective, we have seen a lot of overlap between, say, like anti-COVID vaccine groups and climate denial groups, and quite a lot of overlap with alternative medicine also. Would people like to comment on their own context? Who would like to go? Raise your hand if you want to speak from the panel on this.
Well,
yeah,
I can start. So, because I would say in Germany we can also see a similar overlap. I mean, here also anti-COVID demonstrations were massive. They had a very big support base in society, and there we could see how right-wing populists and also these groups or kind of think tanks that that previously were involved in climate denial discourses, like the Eike Institute in Germany, they also started to focus on COVID, and there we could see. So if you trace their online coverage and social media output, how there was kind of a mix of conspiracy theories being voiced on COVID and still maintaining the discourse on climate change and climate denial. So that certainly happened here too.
Yeah, that's true in Spain as well. We have seen, especially, I would say after COVID or since COVID, since the pandemic, the rise of these strange theories is stronger and stronger, and that goes to the point that the faith on science is dropping, and this makes it a problem to base your politics on science against climate change. And I don't know how we could handle this, but this is a reality in Spain as well, and I think it is pushed and promoted by climate skeptics, climate deniers. I think that it is not something which is happening by chance. It's something which is being pushed to avoid strong climate action.
I can add something on that is quite different tactics. We see in Italy, there is an alliance between Eni and the larger farmers organization called Diretti. And the tricky point is that the farmers organization are claiming because of damages for the climate crisis, but at the same time they are campaigning against wind and solar. So this is a very clear example of, let's say, climate hypocrisy, which is very interesting because they know they are speaking to different segments of the public, and they can take a contradiction in their messaging. Coldiretti has been signing agreement with Eni, I think is on the oil consumption for agricultural oil or gas oil, and also they are funding their, from the peasant to the consumer kind of initiative they do all around Italy. So they take money from oil and gas for doing this, and they have maybe 1 million people, supporters, people that are part of the organization. So very powerful, and that's another example of how tricky is the game.
Thank you. So we're almost out of time. We've got 2 minutes left. I think just as we wrap up, I had a last question really about how the far right, thinking of the elections coming up, how the far right has weaponized climate and instrumentalized other concerns people have about the green transition. And you were saying, Juan, that you think in reality, these far right parties don't have a broad base of support. Do you think there's any way that could come back in a way that ends up being positive for climate if climate is somehow, opposition to climate gets wrapped up with far right fascist ideologies? Could that ultimately, trying to find some positive here, could that kind of produce a pushback where actually people who don't want to be associated with fascist ideologies feel more, empowered to support climate positive policies.
Yesterday, I was reading an article in El País, which may be surprising for some, but I thought was I agreed very much, which was saying something like, we need to recover common sense right wing. There was a time when right wing was not that extreme, and they could take scientific arguments on their political agenda. Unfortunately, because of the influence of extreme right populism, this has disappeared or has vanished. And I think that that's probably one of the keys for the future of the climate debate, is that we have a conservative which are back to the scientific agenda. And I hope this happens. It's not on our hands, of course, because I'm talking from the green side of politics, but I think that that's one of the keys, to convince common sense right-wing politicians to come back to the climate agenda.
Thank you for that answer. That brings us to the end exactly of our session, slightly over, but we sneaked in a bit more time there for questions and discussion. Thank you, everybody, for putting together those excellent presentations. You can read the whole book very soon. And if you stay put here, we have the next session now where you can hear about climate obstruction in Sweden, Netherlands, and the EU, which were traditionally seen as progressive. And then finally, to wrap up from the messages today, it seems one of the key points for me going up to the polls is that politicians aren't reflecting their citizens' concerns on climate. They're allowing themselves to be led by the extreme wings of or extreme parties to their right, or media that take extreme positions. And this is producing paralysis and backsliding. But a huge step towards solving this is making these forces visible, as you are in this book, and mapping and showing these connections. And then now, I guess, the real work begins, political work and alliance building to tackle it. So I will end with a small plug for Desmog. We have a session, a series rather, on the EU elections, looking at food and farming misinformation in particular. I'm going to sort of drop that into the chat now and hand you over for the next
Back
session.
to me. Thank you so much, Hazel. That was a brilliant job of moderating. And my huge thanks to our authors, Moritz, Stella, Jose, and your whole teams, and then Juan and Giuseppe for really powerful discussion. Really brings home how important this work is and how far we have to go. It's sobering. It's quite a sobering moment right now. And I feel like, I'll say we, because I've been working on climate change for 30 years. We're quite naive in acting and believing that our societies would respond in sort of a rational way to the increase of information and knowledge about this global problem, and really lacked the understanding of the opposition that we were going to face. So if there's any bright side, I think it's one that certainly gets me up every morning, is understanding that our role can be quite important in pointing out the actors, understanding what their tactics are, who they're in coalition with, and what are their discourses, and then how do they influence the society. So, and what can we do about it? I think that's one thing we really want to try to focus on going forward. So as I as I started my notes for this conference, I have sort of what's the research agenda box here at the bottom of the page that I'm going to keep filling in, and then sort of making it useful. How can we make this work useful? So please keep in touch with us. I have to say, as an academic conference, that was a great session. It held together, and we had powerful commentators, and we're about to have another great one. Before we go on, though, I did want to thank We and Goliath, our hosts, who are behind the scenes. Jake Daniels on here. I'm not sure who else is back there, but these guys have been great. This is our third year working with them. It is seamless, and they're pleasant, wonderful people. I encourage people to consider using them if you're hosting an online conference or a hybrid one, because they're really good. But I really again want to thank all of you for this session. It's a great start. Any other announcements before we get on? I think we are going to go straight into our session. We'll put some things in the chat as we move along. As Hazel said, this is our session about countries that are seen as progressive. I mean, from the United States, we think, oh, Europe is doing so much. Oh, Sweden is an exemplar, and the EU has got amazing targets and is moving, you know, with very progressive policies. And yet, as a co-editor of this book, my overwhelming feeling in this effort has been that it's almost a miracle that anything is happening, including especially in Europe, and that these countries really do have organized interests. So we're going to hear Kel and Christopher talking about Sweden, Martin, and Hoos are talking about Netherlands, and I think Tobias will be our speaker on the EU. And I also want to emphasize how pioneering these efforts are. There really weren't national summaries. I mean, actually, Sweden is the one place where Christopher and Kel and others have put together some more systematic views. But in most of these countries, we don't have, until a week from now, when we'll have the public version of this book, national summaries about what's going on, looking broadly at climate obstruction. So this is a big landmark moment, and the EU chapter is quite revelatory for people like me. But what's really exciting also is we have Claire Carlisle, who's a researcher at Desmog, where she focuses on the agribusiness sector, and she'll be our commentator. Prior to joining the organization, she was co-editor and researcher at Ethical Consumer magazine, where she specialized in migrant workers' rights in the food industry. So Claire, thank you for being here. It's fantastic. Amy Westervelt was traveling, and we had a bit of a miscommunication. We've dropped the ball on that one. So just to get us started, we're going to start with Sweden. Kel Vowles is a PhD candidate at Chalmers University of Technology. With a background as a climate journalist, he focuses research on media discourses, climate obstruction as part of far-right ideology, and the use of nationalism to hinder climate action, entirely related to what we just heard. And Christopher Ekberg is an assistant professor at human ecology at Lund University, part of the Center for Studies of Climate Change Denialism at Chalmers University of Technology, and his research focuses on the political history of the environment and climate change. And 10 minutes, guys, and then I'll start pinging you. So thanks for being here. Thanks for presenting.
Great. Thank you so much. I guess a quick check with Christopher. Do you want to do your slides, or shall I do it all?
No, you can do it all, and I'm
okay. Great. Shall I now share my screen? Can everyone see that?
Yeah,
okay.
That looks good.
And hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, great. Yes, so thank you, Timmons, and thank you, CSSN, for organizing this conference and this fantastic conference, and the book, the Climate Obstruction, a fantastic book. So my name's Kjell Vowles. I'm a PhD candidate at Chalmers University of Technology for another week, and I'll be defending my PhD. And I've written this chapter together with Kristoffer Ekberg at Lund University and Martin Hultman, who's also at Chalmers. So Sweden as a progressive country, a lot of you probably sort of have the idea of Sweden being a progressive welfare country when it comes to both environmental issues and perhaps equality and sustainability and whole host of issues. And there is some truth in that. So Sweden has lowered its territorial emissions more than most other industrialized countries. And it has a low carbon electricity mix, mainly hydro and nuclear power. And often when the discourse about the transition, it's a discourse about electrification that's been pushed, that we need to sort of change our fossil fuel cars towards towards electric vehicles, and that comes back to this electricity mix. And historically, there has been a tacit political agreement that climate change is a serious issue and that Sweden should be a forerunner. And this political agreement, that with the 7 sort of traditional parties in the Swedish parliament, so up until 2010, there were 7 parties in the Swedish parliament, from the left party to the sort of center-right conservatives. And they all basically accepted that climate change was serious, that we need to act, and Sweden has an important role to play. But this forerunner discourse has always been one of climate action and economic growth going hand in hand, which has led to incremental but too slow emissions reductions. So while greenhouse gas emissions has been going down since the 1970s, they're still not going down quick enough to meet the Paris Agreement or to even meet what is Sweden's own climate goals. So that's and often this discourse is framed as a common sense discourse that we can act, but we can't act in a way that sort of threatens economic growth or anything like that. And actors, when they argument, aim to push action beyond this middle way, as we call it in our chapter. They have often been targeted or quickly been targeted by obstructionist actors, saying that we need to sort of keep, it's framing the discourse as a way that action is okay as long as it doesn't threaten any of our lifestyle, any of our economic well-being. So these obstructionist actors then, they are a persistent community, we argue, that we show in our chapter, and this is especially the work of Giuseppe, and they came up with from sort of the 1970s and the critique against the limits to growth and the report from the Club of Rome. The same actors has sort of been pushing back against anyone wanting to go beyond the middle way. And key actors in this sphere, in this community, are the Confederation of Swedish Enterprise, and that's the organization that consolidates basically all Swedish industry. And Sweden is quite an exceptional case in that most industry is connected to this one organization. So there's not a whole lot of different organizations to look at. They all sort of tied to the Swedish Confederation of Swedish Enterprise. And they have got their own think tanks, such as Timmons and Grasso, SNS, and the Nya Välfärden, which means the new welfare. And they've been using public relations firms such as KEAB and also media such as the big Swedish daily Svenska Dagbladet. But here it's important to notice that it's always been the editorials of these big legacy newspapers where some of these arguments have been pushed. But within the news section, they've quite often been marginalized. And there's been the consensus that climate change is serious. And the argument that's then been pushed is that the environmental movement is alarmistic, that economic growth is needed for addressing this issue, that regulatory policy is banned for competitiveness. It's better to have policies that in somehow will be voluntary or pushing it down to consumer choice or those kinds of policies rather than having regulations that actually limit the emissions that's allowed. And that markets are better than science at knowing what to do. So the science can show us where we're at, but we should leave it up to the markets to sort of show the way forward. And as we've been talking about and was mentioned in the last session, these are international networks. So climate obstruction in Sweden is not only related to domestic debates and politics. And there was talk in the last session about sort of saying that climate activists are terrorists or pushing for harsher penalties And that is one of the discourses that has been adopted and come straight into Sweden, and there's been a push that civil disobedience should be judged to be sabotage, which would really sort of result in lengthier prison sentences than if it would be just civil disobedience. And strategies and arguments are here disseminated globally according to best practice. There is the discourse of sort of activists being terrorists working in another country, then it's been picked up in Sweden as well and being pushed here. And vice versa. If some taxes will work here, we would imagine that they are being spent to other countries later. And the Atlas Network plays a role here, where some of the think tanks mentioned previously connected to the Swedish Confederation of Swede Enterprise are members, such as Grasso, Timmons, and more. They are partners and members of the International Atlas Network. And several key actors in our chapter have had a strong presence in international settings. And this also involves a few contrarian scientists that also has been involved in sort of Heartland Institute and been presenting at the conferences in the US and access to the NIPCC report and those kinds of things. So we can see that there are international connections here. And then what has happened in Sweden, and perhaps this is where Sweden, we've seen, it was mentioned in the German case, but perhaps it's even more clear in Sweden, where there has been, as I said in the beginning, a strong consensus within the main 7 political parties that climate change is serious and Sweden should be at war on it. In 2010, the far-right Sweden Democrats entered parliament, and they started picking up the arguments from these obstructionist actors that I've been talking about. The other parties didn't do it to start with, but the Sweden Democrats have. And during the 2010s, there's been a far-right media ecosystem that has become a forum for spreading denialism, which is closely connected to the Sweden Democrats in both organizational manners and personal manners. And several prominent members of the obstructionist community has, for example, been interviewed in Web TV, which is an online digital conspiracy TV channel, which is really way beyond the mainstream. But some of these actors that has been prominent within industry in Sweden has started sort of accepting to be interviewed there. And this has stated that the climate change in Sweden now has become a lot more contested than it has been previously, where there has been a consensus, now there is contention. And as was mentioned in the Spain case, we also see this spreading from the far right to the Conservative Party, who are also sort of picking up some of these messages. And what we argue is that within far-right Swedish nationalism, there is an ideological appeal of looking back to the oil-driven years of uninterrupted economic growth of the 1950s and 60s, when men had lifelong careers in industry and there was less worry about environmental pollution. So there's also an agenda aspect in this, and this kind of ties back to ideas of anti-reflexivity that was prominent in early work on the climate change denial machine, but that the anti-reflexivity is not just about environmental issues, it's also about gender issues and science issues and beliefs in economic growth.
Yeah, time to wrap it up.
Yeah, that's me. So thank you.
Wow, that was the end. Okay.
Yeah.
Well, okay. Thanks so much, Kel and Christopher. Now we're moving on to the Netherlands. And I should say, you know, I liked how Hazel had a little bit of review in there, sort of the environmental movement getting villainized. Growth is needed, you know, is being projected that it's really the right-wing media is taking on some quite denialist discourses. These are themes we're going to see in a lot of other countries. So to have this happening in Sweden is quite notable to us outside of Sweden. So Netherlands, Martin, Duveld is associate professor of the cultural geography group at Wageningen University. He's engaged in research that exposes how large industry obstructs transitions to a low emission society and climate justice. And Hoestieks is assistant professor at the Center for Higher Education Policy Studies at University of Twente. As an economic sociologist and sociologist of science, he studies the relationship between scientific knowledge and political power, and apologies for the bad pronunciation.
That's fine. Thanks. So I will give the presentation and start sharing my screen now. Let's see whether that works. Is that visible right now?
Yes, but it's not in presentation
Yeah.
mode, it's in the other mode.
Why is that?
Maybe press the slideshow. Yeah, resume slideshow up in the upper left.
I do that now.
There we go. Let's see.
But it's still not doing that, right?
Correct.
Still see. Okay.
Maybe one of our support folks, Glenn or
Oh, wait. It's still, I think, in the other one.
Jake. Are you guys back there if you have any thoughts about this?
No. I think it's doing it in the other screen that I have. It's annoying.
Yeah, you may want to stop your share and start again and make sure you have just that window and not the whole screen.
Yeah, let's find that out. Thanks.
Okay, try again.
Not really, huh?
Still seeing the sort of working mode.
Yeah.
Maybe you can make the big window bigger. Yeah, reduce the area for the notes, and we can see it better. Can you do that?
I can't really. Let's see if I can just open myself here. Yeah.
Yeah, that'll do. It's not beautiful, but let's get going. Yeah. Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks very much, and apologies for that technical glitch.
No, you're fine.
Yeah, so thanks and welcome to the presentation on the Dutch case, which has the gas fields of and oil and gas fields of the Netherlands, as well as small cheese blocks, and the one which you can actually get as a treat here, mind you, which also stands for the high emissions from the agricultural sector, which we didn't cover. I do want to touch upon. So the introduction was already there. That's also mentioned briefly that I'm also a climate activist for Extinction Rebellion and Scientist Rebellion, as photos of researchers are usually more boring. I added a few of them. Activism was already a topic in the last session, and I just want to emphasize that it is as strong as the number of people deciding to join the movement. So that's also a call on you to reconsider. First of all, and as already mentioned, a big thank you to all the NGOs and research journalists that have put in so much effort and work into revealing all these obstructionist efforts in the Netherlands, because as we found out, there was actually quite a little academic work. And so also apologies on behalf of the scientists. We are trying to rapidly catch up here. But a big thank you to all the organizations and authors presented here. Now, Netherlands likes to present itself as one of the best countries to live in, and also as one of the climate progressive countries. But we want to partly see this chapter as a way to counterbalance that, to say the least. So I want to start with a quote from Jeroen Kandel, associate professor at Wageningen University, environmental policy, who spoke to the European Parliament and says, "The Dutch political self-image is still that of an international sustainability leader, but the Netherlands should be called out for what it is. A country that has belonged to the top exploiters of ecosystems, vulnerable populations and animals, and remains unwilling to take significant actions to reverse these impacts." And I would say what goes for environmental policy also goes for climate policy, as we show in our chapter. We start the chapter with basically 3 waves of climate obstruction. So every time that there was increased attention to climate change, to climate impact, you also see an increase in the obstructive efforts of key players in the Dutch political and industrial field. So in the late 1980s, early 1990s, I would say it was still possible to call the Netherlands a climate progressive country. Actually, it took the lead in international climate politics, organizing close to the sea, one of the big national conferences that almost led to global climate politics. But in the early 1990s, you also see that an emergence of climate skepticism and climate skeptic arguments in parliament and by professors here portrayed as a chemical professor, Fritz Butcher, funded by Shell and other industries to spread climate skeptic arguments. Now you also see the first opposition by employers' organizations and ministries that fear that there will be too strict regulations, particularly related to energy taxes. A second wave of both attention and obstruction you see in the late 2010s when Gore's Inconvenient Truth came out, leading to an increased call for action both by the Dutch Prime Minister, by the British Prime Minister, also on Europe to do more on climate action. And again, you see opposition emerging, especially from employer organizations that say that we run the risk in the Netherlands of being the only strict follower of the Kyoto Protocol. 2009 is also ClimateGate, and you see that in 2010, when the Dutch new coalition formed, together with the climate skeptic and extreme right-wing PVV, that climate sort of drops out of the coalition agreement, as well as generally from considerations in politics. The third wave we see from 2015 onward, not just the Paris Agreement, which was of course important, but also from an NGO that took the Dutch state to court and won that case actually for more strict enforcement of mitigation objectives. And you see that from 2017 onward, when the government had to consider these court verdicts, you see increased attention again for climate action, but also a very problematic, difficult relationship or difficult sort of approach, where the high emitters are given an important seat at climate tables, where they can discuss with government on how they would like to see the transition unfold. Now we focus from these, base of these 3 climate waves and obstruction waves, from the tactics and sort of deeper underlying structural forces we see in Dutch society. So we do see indeed strategic obstruction, so intentional attempts to denial, delay, and frame the fossil industry as part of the solution, lobbying and networking, etc. In the chapter, we went one step further to see, okay, what is particular about this Dutch case that undergirds these more strategic, intentional attempts of certain actor groups in the Netherlands to obstruct climate policy. And we came up with 3. So the first is a distinct governance ideology, which we even have invented our own name for. It's Polder model. So it's a consensus-based decision-making procedure in politics, where important firms, companies, are given a seat at the table, as you could see it at the climate tables. So that makes it difficult to see it just as lobbying if government simply invites all these companies to co-construct, co-determine climate policy. We also see historic dependencies between particular firms such as Shell, but also KLM, with the Dutch state, that are very closely intertwined, and where one helps out the other. And finally, we see revolving doors, which was already mentioned before, and particularly with Shell, and that goes for the complete political center. So for social democrats, social liberals, Christian Democrats, as well as right-wing conservatives, they have this ongoing relationship with Royal Dutch Shell. Now, it brings us to the question, where are we now? And what we see in the Dutch case is that because of the proximity between particularly Shell, so the fossil fuel industry, and the Dutch state, that they often work together also in lobbying for specific climate policies. For instance, for controversial techno-fixes like carbon capture and storage, you see that the direct access that the CEO from Shell has to the Dutch Prime Minister and to the Ministry of Economic Affairs makes sure that they work together in convincing or lobbying the European Union for certain technological solutions that benefit the Dutch fossil fuel industry, of course, with the help of very high subsidies. And the second thing in which we still see that systemic obstruction working out in the Netherlands is that, we currently, perhaps we're not the first, but I think a lot of eyes in Europe are also on that new coalition government. We see that now sort of right-wing conservative parties that have this business-friendly attitude are joining forces with climate skeptic extreme right-wing parties like the PVV. And the new coalition agreement, or at least the start of that, came out last week. And so we can see what happens when these two sort of forces meet. And what we then see is that, they officially still subscribe, commit to the climate objectives, but at the same time start themselves to undermine or to cut back on the policies that could actually make it possible to achieve these goals. For instance, increasing North Sea gas extraction, undoing climate policies like increasing speed limits on the Dutch highways and abandoning policies for heat pumps, and continue to emphasize the need for industry-friendly dialogues and subsidies for the Dutch fossil fuel industry and the chemical industry. Now, from there, how do we move on? It was wonderful to write this chapter, to bring all that knowledge that was distributed among many different organizations and individuals together. We'll do two things. First, we're already in the process of launching a Dutch climate obstruction network, which will go online and invite academics, NGOs, and research journalists to join forces from June onwards. And I think also for the German case, or the presenter of the German case also mentioned, and I think rightfully so, that these different groups should work closer together, specifically to address the huge networking power that is also there and present at the opposite side of the equation. And second, we'll ourselves also continue to expand the research on climate obstruction in the Netherlands, for instance, working on Dutch petroculture. So the way fossil ties in culture, society, politics, and science have become normalized, have become very much part and parcel of the way things work in the Netherlands, as well as we work on obstructive solutions. So the way the fossil fuel industry also managed to co-determine the mitigation agenda in a way that we might consider also obstructive in slowing down efforts to decarbonize. Because as Geert Bulens, a professor of environmental history, mentioned, there's such a level of banal petroculture that Shell seems as natural in Dutch culture as tulips, bicycles, and windmills. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hoos. I wish I could say that Shell is not as synonymous as tulips and bicycles and canals, or whatever the last one was. But thank you. That was excellent and right on time. So we have another case of a country where it seems progressive, and we see all the bicycles and we think this is just ecotopia, and yet there's just incredibly strong ties between the government and the leading corporate actors like Shell and KLM. So that brings us to our last case of the EU, and Tobias Haas is going to be speaking about that, where we've really not heard much before, but this is super important, especially with the elections coming up in about 2 weeks. Tobias is a research associate at the Research Institute for Sustainability in Potsdam. His research interests lie at the intersection of heterodox political economy and political ecology, with a research focus on Germany and the EU. Tobias, it's all yours.
Yeah, thank you, Timmons. Can you see my slide?
Yeah, again, yours is in the sort of working mode, and it includes your speaker. There you go. Yeah, now maybe flip up to the beginning. There you go.
All right, great. I will present the chapter on the EU that I authored together with Moritz Neujeffski and Dieter Plewe from Berlin Social Science Center. And I want to start with a brief overview of the history of the process of European integration and with a focus on climate policy. The first climate targets were already set by 1990 in the EU, and the importance of the environmental dimension during the process of European integration has been upgraded step by step. Another important step was the Amsterdam Treaty of 1997, and so far the EU achieved the climate targets, but there are really very massive challenges ahead. The actual commission led by Ursula von der Leyen was really quite ambitious regarding climate policy. I think you are all familiar with the European Green Deal that was presented in late 2019. And within this context, target was set by 2030 to decrease emissions by at least 55%. And also a net zero target was set by 2050. And this was further became more concrete with the European climate change law. Against this background, you can see that the EU is becoming more and more important regarding the regulation of environment and also regulating climate change. And with this increase in importance, also lobbying and obstruction efforts at the European level have increased. This is one argument we develop in the chapter, and we further argue that the secondary form of obstruction is the dominant one in the EU. Christopher Ekberg and his co-authors distinguished three forms of obstruction, and the secondary form is not denying climate change, but it is rather sowing doubt about ambitious climate policy measures. And these efforts are decisive on the European level, also due to the fact that sphere of civil society is a limited one in the EU. So we focus on companies and business associations, as well as think tanks. And based on data from Influence Map, we distinguish the gray and the green coalition. The green one on the agenda of the companies and associations of the green spectrum are in line with the Paris Climate Agreement and the European Green Deal, whereas the agenda of the gray spectrum isn't. I mean, on an abstract level, they all support the Green Deal and the Paris Agreement, but when it comes to concrete policies for achieving these targets, then there's a lot of resistance. And you can see that the companies and associations of the gray spectrum outnumber the ones from the green spectrum. And when we look at the financial resources, then the imbalance becomes quite obvious, especially on the level of the associations. And we focused, or we illustrated forms of climate obstruction in two cases. The first one is the European emissions trading system that was introduced already in 2005. And we are now in the fourth phase. And the most severe problem of the EU ETS, which is often called the flagship of the European climate policy, is that there has been a massive overallocation of certificates, and most allowances are allocated for free. And against this background, there has been very low incentives for emissions reduction, because the price has been very low and only recently increased from 2021 onwards. And this massive overallocation of the allowances is due to pressure from different lobbies. And the argument was always that there's a huge threat for carbon leakage, a relocation of production to other areas of the world with lower environmental and climate policy ambitions. And one example is a study by the Boston Consulting Group for Semboro, the Association of the Concrete Industry in the EU, and they argue that clinker and cement production in the EU is not competitive without free allowances. As a result, the wise businessman will prefer to relocate production to more competitive countries, this leading to production offshoring. And then they argue that CO2 prices shouldn't go up a certain threshold. The second area we had a look at where the negotiations on the green taxonomy for sustainable activities. And the contested question was what type of investments can be classified as sustainable. And a technical expert group was set up in 2018, and the group proposed the exclusion of fossil gas and nuclear energy from the scope of the green taxonomy. But yeah, there were again strong efforts to influence the taxonomy by a wide range of corporate actors and think tanks. And the key frame they used was the one of technology neutrality. They argued that not the European Commission shall decide, but the market. And due to the various lobby efforts by business actors, as well as some governments, nuclear energy and also gas found its way in the taxonomy. And then I already come to the conclusion and the outlook. We show that climate policy is a very contested terrain in the EU and an important one. And there are massive obstruction efforts. There are about 25,000 lobbyists working in Brussels. And the key approach of the EU is a form of ecological modernization. And within this framework, climate obstructionists always argue that climate policy measures shall be market-based, that they shall be technology neutral, and that they shall enhance competitiveness of European industry. And in this regard, they often argue that there's a huge threat of carbon leakage. And this is more kind of an outlook. There will be elections to the European Parliament on June 9th, and the right-wing groups of ECR and ID are expected to win up to 25% of the votes. So probably the new parliament will look rather different. And there are different scenarios possible. One is a rollback of EU climate policies. Another scenario is that conservative forces and more left or liberal green forces join forces. But in any way, there's really a huge pressure on the European Green Deal. We can already see this, especially in the new regulations in the agrarian sector. So unfortunately, the outlook is not very optimistic, but we'll see, and maybe the election results won't be as worse as one can fear right now. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tobias. When we found out our time for the launch of this book would be right before the elections, we realized that it was quite important. And so our actual physical launch of the book will be on the 30th of May in Brussels. So I want to thank you all in advance for participating in that press conference. And now I'm going to hand it over to Claire Carlisle, who's a researcher at the award-winning climate investigation outlet that we all rely on so much, Desmog, where she focuses on agribusiness sector. Prior to joining the organization, she was co-editor and researcher at Ethical Consumer Magazine. So thank you so much, Claire. Really appreciate your any feedback that you have, comments on the talks, and any direction you'd like to take us. Maybe you could talk for 7 or 10 minutes if you like. Thanks.
Yeah, amazing. I mean, they're such interesting presentations, and this is such valuable work. So thank you, and thanks for including me in it. Yeah, I mean, I think I was thinking a lot as you were speaking, and also kind of ahead of this conference, about what it means for these countries to have kind of this like baseline of considering themselves progressive. I mean, Desmog has an office in the US and an EU office, and I think sometimes, yeah, we can get the impression that there's something much more extreme happening in America, as you were saying, compared to in Europe. But I think the value of these chapters is thinking about kind of actually that this baseline progressive image, it seems like it can almost give opportunities to obstructionism and allow obstructionist forces to deploy that to their advantage. I think this is something that we see a lot. We spend a lot of time looking at kind of lobbying of the European Union. And I think this message, we're seeing more and more this message of kind of, we're all on the same page, being the prelude to every kind of lobbying action industry is taking. And I do think, it's allowing kind of massive capture of regulatory processes around partial solutions, like pushing things like hydrogen, pushing CCUS, in farming, which is my area of expertise, pushing ideas like suppressing methane in cattle by changing feed rather than cutting numbers, even though, most scientists would say you do need to address livestock figures. Yeah, I found Tobias's kind of description of secondary obstructionism really interesting. I think like this, when I was lucky enough to kind of read some of the chapters ahead of this and talking about this kind of like whataboutism that seems to be a key part of secondary obstructionism, that there's always kind of economic reasons or, cultural reasons that bring climate action into debate. And I think, I mean, talking from my agriculture focus, that's kind of the key thing that we've seen. A few years ago in 2020, the EU introduced very progressive looking policies around kind of the environment and agriculture. And these have just been totally wiped out. And I think the key tactic that was used by the industry players was this kind of whataboutism. And it was mainly about food security. So if we take these measures, what's going to happen in terms of our food production? We're going to kill the industry. We're going to kill off the farming tradition. We're not going to have enough to eat. And I think that example to me really showed how kind of emotive secondary obstructionism can be. I think, I mean, there's an amazing quote from Syngenta when the EU was looking at pushing these policies through, which Syngenta is one of the world's largest, in fact, I think it is the world's largest pesticide producer. And it was putting out articles saying lower yields mean more people go hungry. You know, it was really kind of scary, alarmist tactics. So yeah, I think it's really important to be looking at this secondary obstructionism in the way that you guys are. And you know, likewise, similarly, it makes me think kind of the way that companies have exploited Russia's invasion of Ukraine, with really fear-mongering around food security, suddenly putting out, you know, an investigation by Desmog found that straight after the invasion, major gas trade industry groups started putting out these social media posts talking about kind of the need for gas expansion projects to address the risks around Russia's invasion of Ukraine. I think part of the reason why this book and the work that you guys are doing seems so valuable as a journalist is because I think it's, you know, this kind of more subtle obstructionism in progressive countries is very hard to gain public interest in sometimes. I think because it's so nuanced, telling the story of why it's an issue and kind of breaking through that we're all on the same page narrative can be extremely difficult. And I also think, you know, in a way that I think one of the chapters talked a little bit about the fact that most media now doesn't peddle outright climate denial. I think there is a lot of media outlets that do still peddle this kind of more nuanced obstructionist narratives. You know, this is an example in the UK, so not one of the countries we're looking at in this session, but last year, one of my colleagues showed that the gas industry, supported by a PR company, had done a massive push, which saw lots of newspapers in the UK cover heat pumps as kind of Soviet style, financially irrational. It gave them a really, really bad image in press. And, you know, whereas some of these papers, I'm sure, wouldn't put out climate denial, they're kind of happy to put in those more subtle arguments about, you know, the economic rationale isn't there, they're going to increase inequality, things like this. And I think that is, I mean, that's certainly something we see with European press in Brussels, like Politico and like Euractiv, that have an incredible amount of sponsored content. And while it's not climate denial, it is this kind of more subtle obstructionism. But I think, you know, it's also really great that you guys are looking at how kind of outright denial and secondary obstructionism work together. Yeah, I mean, with Tobias's quite scary closing thing on the EU elections coming up, I think, so we're, as Hazel mentioned in the last session, at Desmog, we're doing a big project on misinformation around the EU elections and kind of capture by the far right. And I think something that we're noticing is this division, in fact, within the far right, where some groups, for example, in Germany, are very extremist around a lot of topics, including climate, but other groups are making themselves much more acceptable. And I think this kind of spectrum can make things that are extreme look very normalized. You know, when there is climate denial out there, I think it can make anything that isn't downright climate denial look kind of centrist, or give it kind of a publicly acceptable face. I think we're seeing this, you know, it sounds like from what Gus was saying that we're seeing this in the Netherlands, but definitely with groups like the National Rally in France, where they're pushing messages like eco-patriotism. You know, they're saying we are kind of in line with environmental goals, we support them, but we don't think we should do anything to get there. It's got to be economically viable. You know, is making that kind of real slowing of climate policy seem just kind of very centrist and distracting from the fact these are still far-right groups. So yeah, I guess my final reflection on what everyone was saying was just it is fascinating that the Netherlands, which has just agreed what is a pretty right-wing government, and it is seen as kind of this progressive state, and also that the European Union, which may just get a massive far right win, is also kind of in this chapter. And so I guess something that I would love to hear your guys' thoughts on is how do we deal with that like constant risk of a slide even further into obstructionism than we already are in progressive states like these.
Thank you, Claire. That's great and of course sobering. So let's bring our panelists or our paper presenters back up here on the spotlights if we can. Thank you, Jake. I think it's Jake back there. And so maybe you guys want to take a swing at this first question from Claire, and then we do have two others that I can pitch forward from the audience. So somebody put their hand up and go after this. Is it going to get worse? I think that was the nature of your question. Christopher, good to have your voice here.
Yeah. No, but I think what we've seen in Sweden is a very bleak development where actually, like from a historical perspective, we can see that similar arguments are reappearing that have sort of simmered below surface for a long time or not been very prominent. But right now we see that the far right really has become like an ally in defending industry, defending capitalism in large. So right now I would almost describe it as like what Cara Daggett has called climate refusal. Like it's not even, addressing the issue, maybe saying we will address it, but in no sense acting upon it. And we've seen, a lot of climate policies actually being rolled back in recent years. So I think, to me, it doesn't look very promising right now. And as Kjell has looked at in his dissertation, we also see sort of, literal denial actually flourishing in Sweden or becoming more prominent. I don't know if you want to say something more, Kjell, but I think it's very, I don't know, an alarming development in Sweden where we see this powerful alliance where the Sweden Democrats, who used to be perhaps more nostalgic about the welfare state, actually have gone full on pro-business in many issues. So but
before anybody else takes on this question is just to say, was this inevitable as we've been setting targets and talking about climate change, and everybody got to have some good public relations, including firms and governments when they set targets. And now it's time to do the work of actually implementing them. So it means real cuts in, in emissions, a real installation of large scale renewables, real changes in the economy. So was it inevitable? Maybe we should have anticipated this, or was the union between sort of the right wing and the capital sector always this strong? Anyway,
I mean, historically it's been, but I mean, I would say that of course nothing is inevitable. I wouldn't say that as an historian, but I think we've seen, like, as we argue with this middle way concept, it's obvious that when things have, like, we need to do more, that's when obstruction has sort of reappeared. And I know, like, from Bruhl's work, it's also like when and from what some of the, I don't remember who showed the sort of when climate action or climate policy have been more prominent in the debate, that's when we see more open obstruction or opposition. So I think, of course, if we consider it as a counter movement, then we perhaps should have expected something like this. But yeah.
Yeah, Shell, you want to say it quick, and then we'll go to the others on this one.
And I think Christopher has said everything that's needed to be said about Sweden. So.
Yeah, thanks. Who's?
Yeah, I mean, I think we could have expected it. Like, if there's no real resistance, I would say climate change policy hasn't started. So in that sense, I would say it's good. Of course, not. It's not a good movement. But yeah, so one thing, and I also think one lesson we can draw from our presence here is that basically we can do the same. It's about building strong networks. And I think some of these new ties that have been forgotten or sort of went away for a long while are also being reestablished now, like the ones between academics, research journalists, NGOs, but also between academic movements and the labor movement. I'm not saying we're there, definitely not. But you do see that there is an opportunity. I mean, there are actors that do have the opportunity to be slowly, preferably fast, of course, to be redirected in a new, redirected towards more positive outcomes. So for the labor movement, might also be the case that sticking to incumbent like industries on the way out becomes a risk. I think in Germany you already see attempts to build that connection between the climate and the labor movement. You see that in the Netherlands as well. So yeah, I would say that's definitely something we can take away from the sort of strategizing and network capacity of the reactionary forces. That it's not magic what they're doing, but currently they are very much in a strong position of power and have way easier times to organize. Like even presenting a book at the moment just before an election, I think for a long time, academics wouldn't ask any sort of strategic questions for book publications. They just want their book to be out for the scholarly community. So even if that's not directly getting rid, doesn't mean that we're getting rid of the right-wing threats that we're facing. I think it does give us a sense of direction and a need to push forward.
Yeah, I will say that I'm learning from my students really how to do good intersectional organizing, whatever. They're really focused on that. And one of our papers, this one on on discourses of climate delay in the campaign against offshore wind, we released it with the labor organization here in the state, and got criticized by that for being in bed with a group that's taking money from the wind industry, including European wind developers. But just to say, there will be new attacks depending on new coalitions, so we should be thinking about that. Tobias, you got a quick contribution on this, or we can go to these great questions that are coming in?
Yeah, just a few thoughts. I also think that it's not a huge surprise that there's so much resistance against climate policies, because 10 years ago it was more abstract, and now we have the climate agreement and net zero targets. I don't know when Sweden and the Netherlands shall be climate neutral, but I suppose before 2050. That's the EU targets, and yeah, there has been discussions on a phase out of coal, of internal combustion engines, and so on. So people are really directly affected by climate policy in their daily lives, and also climate change is reality, as we can all experience in one or the other way. And yeah, my perception is that the far right already started preparing the attacks on the climate agenda for decades, and it got intensified during the last few years. And yeah, as the others already said, we have to fight back and build alliances. And I think we also have to counter the discourse that some northern countries or areas or institutions like the EU are progressive, because if we have a second look on the agenda, also the European Green Deal is framed as the green growth strategy. So it's really, in a sense, also a quite conservative strategy, in the sense of it's geared towards preserving the actual capitalist relations. And there's a lot of resources needed from the global south to generate a lot of hydrogen, and the whole clean tech industry needs a lot of resources. So I think, we need also to underline these aspects and criticize climate agendas from this angle.
Thank you. So I'm going to get us through a couple questions, and I do want to get you back on here, Claire, in a minute. But first of all, we had a question from Dieter Zinbauer on Sweden. How is Sweden's first family, the Wallenbergs, who fund so much research and have so much business influence, positioning itself in the climate discourse publicly and behind the scenes? That's a little in the weeds, but I'm curious. Got a quick.
I don't have an answer.
Okay.
I don't think I have an answer. I mean, they are keen on staying in the back or behind the scenes. So I don't know of any research specifically on the Wallenberg family, but no. So I don't know if Martin and Kjell knows more, but
Right, we do have.
No, we haven't done any research. So thank you for organizing the conference, and thank you for having us. But we don't know that when Wallenberg is going public in the Swedish public, it is to defend the airports. So that's about the only time when they actually go into the public, when they specific interest in the industry connected to air travel is threatened with either a flight tax or a discussion regarding not to support the airports in Sweden with public money. So in that sense, you can say that they are showing their faces when they are threatened. On the other side, but this is just more of an anecdotal evidence. So we haven't done any research.
Yeah. Thanks for that. This kind of relates to a question by Ali Hernan, who said he used to work on a project looking at the relationship between the EU and Finland, and interviewed 50 Finnish EU elites. Not sure if that's political or social, sort of economic elites, but who promoted their cause in the Union. They were all convinced that the EU was the absolute pioneer among the so-called superpowers, as they wanted the EU to be on the climate issue. How do you see the role of the EU today within and in relation to the so-called superpowers like the US, Russia, and China? Do you have any thoughts on how this superpower context will affect EU climate policy, as the EU sees this as an important competitive environment? I guess I would add my perception that the EU, with all the sort of precautionary principle approach on environmental issues compared to the United States, was quite different, setting itself as apart. I think this is going to Tobias.
Yeah, thanks. For the process of European integration, the image of an environmental leader was really important. In the chapter, we also quote Lenschow and Sprung, who speak about the myth of a green Europe. And so I think historically, it has really been important. However, the process of European integration was developed, or in last 2 or 3 decades, it was a kind of more peaceful global environment, and now we can all observe that the geopolitical tensions are really increasing. And against this background, I think that also the green agenda is getting under threat because industrial policy or military considerations are getting more and more important. However, at the same time, if you look at the global car market, market is China, and for industrial policy reasons, China is very much pushing forward electric vehicles, which is not the solution for the mobility related problems, but still it's less worth than having internal combustion engines. So there are links between ecological and industrial policy and geopolitical tensions that are really quite complex, and therefore it's difficult to answer.
So we have a couple of questions that are pretty specific to one or the other speaker. So I'm going to leave those for a minute. But Peter Dorman asks, what impact has secondary obstruction had on climate activism in the EU? And I think that would apply as well to the national cases. In the US, green groups have learned the lesson that some kind of initiatives that is directly curtailing carbon emissions are impractical politically, and that effort should go into measures that can attract at least some corporate support. This has dramatically altered the landscape here, and I wonder if you see the same thing or maybe a different set of responses among, I think this is between green groups, among climate activists. Are they sort of tempering their asks and choosing to, adopt a more market-friendly approach? So Tobias, and then I'm going to ask you, Claire, to talk about that one too.
Okay, I mean, I think it's important to have in mind the context of the policy making on the EU level. It's a rather technocratic setting, and compared to the national context, aren't that present because civil society is quite limited. So it's more about classical lobby strategies and less about the mobilization on the streets when it comes to the EU. And it would be definitely interesting to know more about the strategies of the environmental NGOs and how they try to push back the obstructionist efforts, but we didn't focus on that in our research. But maybe others have some thoughts on that.
Perhaps I can add just a little. I would say that the European, I mean, at least Dutch, but also I see that in other European countries, activism is more and more focused on the fossil elites instead of just offering like more of a business-friendly agenda, and also
wait, clarify. You mean attacking those elites as being part of the problem?
Yes, yeah, okay. And also, I mean, and also high carbon lifestyles more generally. So, for instance, getting through the fences on airports towards private jets to single out that the problem we have with climate change isn't. I mean, it's not totally, but by and large, also an elite-driven problem that we can address in different ways than simply being friendly to high emitting companies and individuals. So I would say that is more of a direction that European climate movements are heading, as far as I can see, than being business friendly. Convinced as they are that these sort of European market oriented solutions will never get us to remain, to reach these Paris agreements of 1.5 or a little bit more.
Thanks. Claire, you want to take some thoughts on that? And anything else you'd like to get in here while we have the chance?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really interesting question. I guess there's like, from the work that we do, it seems like there are there are kind of some very market-friendly campaign organizations that are often part of kind of multi-stakeholder partnerships and things like this that lend legitimacy to business-friendly things, business-friendly groups. But I think in general, like, yeah, I would agree with what Goose was just saying, that lots of the campaign groups that we kind of cover or speak to seem to have held very firm on these market-friendly options. I think that one thing, though, that kind of secondary obstructionism or this idea of the way that companies are painting themselves as, oh, we agree with climate targets, it's just that the market will sort the issue out / industry will sort the issue out. I think that one thing that allows industry groups to do is paint campaigners as quite extremist and never happy with anything. You know, I think because campaigners have held out on partial or false solutions like CCS and things like that, the industry responds by painting them as kind of leftist, extremist, anti-everything, anarchist, in a way that, yeah, can make it quite difficult for that group to gain legitimacy or kind of widespread support.
Thanks. Somebody else had their hand up on this, but I wanted to see if Wendell Trio might come in for a word or two, since we have the former head of CAN, Climate Action Network Europe, to talk about if this is changing. But he may be just listening in. Martin, in the meantime, go ahead.
I actually think Shell was first. Do you want to say something on this first, Shell? You raised your hand.
Yeah, but I guess probably would be saying the same thing. But just standing from the Swedish perspective, I would argue that it's perhaps a bit different to what was described in the question, that a lot of the environmental organizations in the 90s were quite institutionalized and tied in with the government, and they were quite what we call the middle way, or sort of the government was trying to compromise between both industry and environmental organizations. But when those emission reductions has turned out not to be enough, the climate, there's been more activism sort of going out on the streets and pushing for harsher policies or harder policies and regulatory policies. So that it's more been, turned away. So the climate activist has turned more to focus on the industry to sort of act against it rather than trying to cooperate with it.
Just to add on that, to be a bit more specific, the middle way could also be described as eco-modernism or ecological modernization, and it's about that ideas of consumer choices and market solutions and end-of-pipe solutions became very prominent in the early 1990s in Sweden, and that also draw in both the environmental organizations towards that logic, as well as the Green political party. So they all kind of merged into thinking that the climate change and the emissions were to be solved by consumer choices and market solutions and end-of-pipe solutions like CCS or hydrogen and those things, to be a bit more specific.
So where does that leave us now? I mean, that's I think you're right on there. That's the story of the environmental movement, certainly in the US as well. Martin, you got any? Like, I mean, are the environmental mainstream around? By the way, Wendell Trio's on a train, so he can't answer us. But are the groups starting to say, well, that didn't work? You know, we've had our asses handed to us for 35, 40 years by obstructionists, and these policies could never have functioned. Now we need to try something else. And yes, Christopher, you're waving.
Yeah. I mean, we still have parts of the Green Party that still argue on basis of economics, like we should invest in wind just purely out of economic reasons. But I think this shift towards addressing extraction and supply rather than emissions, total emissions in this vague, that has been very prominent. And I think that's also why we see in Sweden a push against sort of, yeah, they would say a green planned economy, but basically state efforts to direct investments in, say, green steel or those kind of efforts. So we see an effort from these traditional obstructionists to actually target this this ambition, basically. So there's been a shift also in that sense, and I think we can expect more of that, like targeting of, yeah, the regulatory state or state investments, basically.
So here's a note from Wendell Trio, again, former head of CAN, Climate Action Network Europe, from the train. I think it's important to recognize that the climate movement in Europe is quite diverse, both in vision, tactics, as well as in national and cultural differences, e.g. groups in Eastern Europe are usually less radical. In certain countries, NGOs are generally closer to governments, etc. So that's what's so great about this volume. Europe turned out to be a wonderful region to focus on, that we have so much diversity. And tomorrow we'll hear a lot more about Eastern Europe and other cases that are going to be more troublesome. So this is great. I'm gonna try to merge a couple of questions, but want to make sure that Claire gets to come in if she wants to on the last topic. Would you like to jump in before I combine a couple of questions?
No, go ahead.
Okay, so Francisca Klein said, regarding the EU, Tobias, what are the hopes for CBAM, C-B-A-M? And by the way, we're going to stop in 5 minutes if that everybody wants to stay on. We're now into a little bit of overtime. Is this a ray of hope in overcoming the competitiveness argument across different parties? We have a question for Hus. Are you familiar with Clintel? Can you elaborate on its history in the Czech Republic? It's pretty popular. This World Climate Declaration being raised as a contradiction of scientific consensus on climate change. And then Stefan asked something else that Hus mentioned. Where are we now? And since the climate impacts are happening, climate is changing, nature is destroyed, and the government is degraded, and the environment is degraded. The last 50 years of obstruction had the benefit of the doubt. They could say, well, this may or may not be happening. Well, we can't say that now. And even farmers are complaining of reduced production and so on. Storm, rains, drought, it's everywhere. So how much is that an influence on obstruction? That might be a nice place to get some reflections. We've had a little bit mentioned on it so far, but Hus, you want to start?
Sure. Yeah. Clintel is definitely part of our chapter, although I didn't mention it explicitly. It's difficult to cram everything in 10 minutes. Yeah, it's sort of an offspring of earlier. It's still of earlier climate skeptic think tanks in the Netherlands, and it has a similar sort of structure. Even people like emeritus professor in chemistry that is also leading that organization. Yeah, in the Netherlands, I would say, yeah, it has an effect because it still informs extreme right-wing parties who make use of their expertise, and I think also they have a strong position in the international network, writing big, allegedly peer-reviewed reports that say the exact opposite or try to counteract official climate science. For Dutch politics, I'm not sure whether that really matters, but they do have that network and reach out also to, for instance, present in Brussels together with climate skeptic Euro parliamentarians. Yeah, that would be my 2 cents.
I think I'll hand it to Claire next.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to just say something about the last question about, where are we now when the impacts are so obvious? I mean, I feel like it feels like there's like two answers. One, which is like, obviously, it does force people to confront it. I can talk about this in terms of farming, that in the UK, for example, I have seen lots more farmers speaking recently on Twitter about climate change because there's been kind of really wet weather and there have been huge, I mean, I think pretty devastating crop losses for a lot of farms, and it has sparked a lot of conversation. But I don't think that it's inevitable that that will happen. In the Netherlands, there's also been very wet weather, and our kind of team that's working on misinformation has picked up that some very right-wing forces have started a conspiracy theory which says that it's geoengineering, it's weather manipulation controlled by the government. So it's kind of new, scary things coming forward. And I think, I mean, what I would say in the farming sector is that there definitely are a lot of farmers who are very concerned about this and are making big changes. But I think also the experience of the impacts can generate more fear, which can lead to kind of short-termism. I guess a lot of farmers are already struggling, and it really fuels the question of food security and the appeal of either kind of immediate and not very effective solutions, or it kind of backs up those arguments that say we can't afford to make changes because we're already in such a crisis. So I think, yeah, it's being careful of how to combat those kind of things as they arise with more extreme weather events.
Okay. One last thought from anybody. We have about a minute left, and then I'm going to just wrap us up, point out what's happening tomorrow, and then what CSSN members can do right after this. Okay, I am going to then say tomorrow at the same time we started today, which was 3 hours ago, we're going to have a session. We're going to welcome you back for just a few minutes. Tomorrow will be hosted by Jennifer Jacquet, so you won't have to look at me all day. And by the way, thank you so much to our panelists and to Claire for presenting and for discussing. That was great. So tomorrow, our first session is about panel 3 on Poland, Czechia, and Ireland, the countries that are traditionally seen as lagging behind. And we have outside the EU, so we have the UK, Scotland, and Russia. And then the third one tomorrow is our big synthesis discussion, assessment, and big discussion on what are the next steps in terms of action and research that we can take on as an organization and as individuals, and where we would like to get going. For CSSN members, you can, now we're going to close this link, and then in 5 minutes, we'll come onto a new link for just a very casual discussion. We have a few topics to discuss, sort of as if we were sitting around with drinks in hand after a day of conference. So we hope you'll go and get your drink in your hand and join us in 5 minutes. And then we have a lot of these member-only sessions on Friday. So I want to thank everybody who stayed with us, everybody who came, everybody who prepared their papers, our discussants, especially our commentators and our moderators. I'm really grateful. And I feel like this has been a great first day, and I'm looking forward to tomorrow and to Friday. So everyone take care. Have a good rest of your day.